Hello everybody, Thomas here, and welcome to the first video on my brand new channel. So if you've seen my playthroughs of Pokemon Scarlet and Violet on my gaming channel, then you'll know that one of my favourite things to do in a Pokemon game is to work on the Pokédex. And this extends to Pokemon Home. Now, Pokemon Home actually keeps track of a national dex that you can fill out by transferring Pokemon into Pokemon Home. However, the Pokemon Company must have expected you to transfer Pokemon from older generations via Pokémon Bank, because it's simply impossible to complete otherwise. So that got me thinking, how much can you actually complete the Pokemon Home Pokédex using only the Switch games? But I'm not going to just stop there. Something that a lot of people don't know is that the mobile version of Pokemon Home actually also tracks two other things, moves and abilities, and I'll be attempting to cover these as well. Before we get started, let's cover some rules. First off, we can only use the Switch Pokemon games. So that's Let's Go Pikachu and Eevee, Sword and Shield, the Sword and Shield Expansion Pass, Brilliant Diamond and Shining Pearl, Legends Arceus, and Scarlet and Violet. Secondly, no transferring Pokemon from older generations via Pokémon Bank. Thirdly, no transferring Pokemon from Pokémon Go. And lastly, no limited time events. Even if you could get special Pokemon back then, you can't now, so they won't count. It's also worth mentioning that obviously there might be mistakes in this video as I'm only human, and that all this info I'm about to give you is what I came up with to the best of my ability using my own research. With all that being said and done, let's get started. Let's begin with the Pokemon themselves. The most logical place to start will be the in-game Pokédexes. If it's in the Pokédex, obviously you can catch it. Let's start with the Let's Go games. Now Let's Go games only have the original 151, meaning we can add all of them from Bulbasaur to Mew, too. As many of you probably know, in the Let's Go games, Mew is only available via the Pokeball Plus. Now you may still be able to find one in stores nowadays if you're lucky enough, and I didn't specifically mention it in the rules, so does it count? Well, it doesn't matter either way, since there's actually another way to get Mew, which I'll mention later. This means the total is currently 150 out of 1008. Moving on to Sword and Shield next, which has a Pokédex size of 400. Now some of those Pokemon have already been accounted for in the Let's Go games, so we simply remove those and adding the rest gets us to 497. Adding in the Isle of Armor gives us 566, and the Crown Tundra gives us 618 out of 1008. Already over halfway there. Next, I'll actually cover Legends Arceus, which features every single Sinnoh Pokemon, including mythicals like Darkrai, Shaman, and even the Pokegod himself, meaning we can actually ignore BDSP for now. Adding the Pokédex from this game gives us 706 out of 1008. Looking at Scarlet and Violet next, our total goes up to 872. Now, as of the time of writing this script, we haven't actually received any word of the rumoured DLC yet, so that's all we'll get from Gen 9 for now. With all the Pokédexes out of the way, I'll now return to talk about BDSP. The thing with BDSP is that it gives you access to almost every single Pokemon from the first 4 generations, mostly via the Grand Underground and other means. Smeargle, Taillow and Swellow can all be obtained via the Pokeradar. Spinder can be obtained via Swarms. Plusle, Minun and Castform can be obtained via the Trophy Garden, and all of these Pokemon can be obtained in the Grand Underground. Now remember when I said we'd come back to Mew? Well, as some of you may know, in Flower Roma Town, there's someone who will give you a Mew if you have save data from either of the Let's Go games. Similarly, the NPC next to them will give you a Jirachi if you have save data from either Sword or Shield. With all this, our total is now 916 out of 1008. Only 92 Pokemon left. Next, I'll cover the Pokemon that are exclusive to the Dynamax Adventures in the Crown Tundra, all of which are legendaries. On the Dynamax Adventures, you can get Raikou, Entei, Suicune, Lugia, Ho-Oh, Latias, Latios, Kyogre, Groudon, Rayquaza, Reshiram, Zekrom, Kyurem, Xerneas, Yveltal, Zygarde, Tapus, Solgaleo, Lunala, Necrozma, and all of the Ultra Beasts. This brings our total to 948. But we're still not done here. Once you obtain 5 Ultra Beasts from the adventures, you can receive a Poipole, which you can evolve into Naganazel. And back in Freezington, you can receive a Cosmog from an NPC once you've defeated the rampaging Glastria or Spectria, which you can evolve into Cosmol. Our last Pokemon in the Crown Tundra is Keldeo. Down Lake Balamere, you'll come across an island with a cooking pot on it. If you then make a curry with all 3 of the Swords of Justice in your party, Keldeo will appear. The final Pokemon we can grab are the Alola Starters. Some of you will remember finding the Alola and Diglett around the Isle of Armor. Collecting them gave you Alolan forms of some Pokemon. 5 gave you Alola and Meowth, 10 gave you Cantonian Slowpoke, 20 for Vulpix, 30 for Sandshrew, 40 for Raichu, 50 for Marowak, 75 for Executor, and 151 for Diglett itself. Now the Alolan forms aren't important for the Pokédex, as they're bunched together with their regular forms, but they will be important later. What we're interested in is the reward of finding 100 Digletts, being the Alola Starters. The starter you receive is based on the Galar starter you picked at the start of the game. Now since we can get Rowlet, Violette and Arceus, you can pick Scorbunny to get Litten in one game, and Sobble to get Popplio in the other game. With this, our final total is 959 out of 1008, leaving only 49 Pokemon left unavailable within our rules. These Pokemon are Celebi, Deoxys, Victini, the Snivy line, the Tepig line, Patra and Wadchog, the Elemental Monkeys, Blitzel and Zebstrika, the Sewaddle line, Ducklet and Swanna, Meloetta, Genesect, all 3 Kalos starters, Furfree, Diancie, Hooper, Volcanion, the Pikapek line, Minior, Marshadow, Regina, Zeraora, Meltan and Melmetal, and Zarude. Next, I'll be covering the moves. Now this was by far the most difficult part for me, and if there are any mistakes or oversights in this video, they're probably in this section. Now while this video is based on the Pokémon Home Pokédex, I actually used the list off of Bulbapedia for this, because Pokémon Home doesn't have Scarlet and Violet compatibility yet. Now the Bulbapedia list actually has a few moves that quite honestly you shouldn't count, like the Z moves, Max moves, and the Summer Build's special Talk moves, which can't even be obtained naturally. So removing moves like that gives us a list size of 808. Once again, I could have made a mistake, this is what I came to. Now the first place I started was TMs. Similar to Pokemon in the Pokédex, if it's a TM, Pokemon can learn it, and thus come and register to Pokemon Home. For this, I'll be starting with Scarlet and Violet this time, which is 171 TMs. Adding the TMs from Sword and Shield gets us to 209, and adding the TRs from that game gets us to 231. The Let's Go games only raise the total to 237, and BDSP gets us to 252 out of 808. Next, I'll cover tutor moves, starting with the Let's Go games, which brings the total to 263. The Isle of Armor brings us to 281, and Legends Arceus brings us to a total of 287 out of 808. Now we move on to moves that can only be learned by level up, and this is where things became a little tricky for me. So the way I did this was by organising the moves into a few tiers. Common moves, which are pretty self-explanatory, uncommon moves, which can only be learned by around 36 Pokemon, rare moves, which can only be learned by 2 Pokemon, and then signature moves, which can only be learned by 1 obtainable Pokemon. Keyword, obtainable. There are some moves in that tier that can be learned by more than 1 Pokemon, but most of them are unobtainable within our rules. I've also divided the signature moves tier between legendary and non-legendary because I felt like it. Now the common moves alone bump us all the way up to 490, because there are a lot of moves in this tier. You really shouldn't have any trouble with any of these. Now the uncommon tier isn't anywhere near as big, only bringing us to 540. These moves can be a little hard to get, but if you completed all the Pokédexes, then chances are you have at least 1 Pokemon that has the move. Now as for the rare moves tier, there are 32 moves here, which brings our total to 572 out of 808, and I'll briefly cover which Pokemon can learn each move. Dragon Hammer can be learned by Alolan Executor and Tropius, though only in BDSP for the latter. Present can only be learned by Delibird and Iron Bundle. Night Days by the Zoroark line and Lunala. Fiery Dance from Volcarona and Iron Moth. Milk Drink from Miltank and Gogoat. Topsy Turvy from the Inkay line and Grablop. Zing Zap from Togedemaru and Pincurchin. Punch Poke from the Phantom line and Grookey line. Confide can only be learned by the Impidimp line and Chatot, though only in BDSP for the latter. Spirit Break can only be learned by Grimmsnarl and Iron Valiant. Both Comet Punch and Dizzy Punch can only be learned by Kangaskhan and Hitmonchan, though only in Let's Go. Razor Wind can only be learned by the Pidgey line and Scyther, though only in Let's Go. Jump Kick can only be learned by the Doduo line and Hitmonlee, in Let's Go only. Twin Needle can only be learned by Beedrill and Cloyster, once again only in Let's Go. Sonic Boom can only be learned by the Magnemite line and Voltorb line, in Let's Go. Egg Bomb can only be learned by Chansey and Executor, though only in Let's Go. Spike Cannon can only be learned by Omastar and Cloyster in, you guessed it, Let's Go. Transform can only be learned by Ditto and Mew. Shed Tail can only be learned by Sycazar and Orthmo. Revival Blessing can only be learned by Pawmot and Rabsca. Axe Kick can only be learned by Medicham and Low Kicks, though I do believe it is worth mentioning that Hisuian Lilligant can also learn it, but only in the Scarlet of Art, meaning you'd have to transfer her. Raging Fury can only be learned by Hisuian Arcanine and Infernape, but only in Legends Arceus. Electrify can only be learned by the Helioptile line and Boltund. Vicious Rend can only be learned by Dracovish and Arctovish. Bolt Beak can only be learned by Dracozolt and Arctozolt. Storm Throw can only be learned by Pinsir and Throw. Triple Kick can only be learned by Hitmontop and Pheromosa. Octazooka can only be learned by Octillery and Grapplock. Sacred Fire can only be learned by Ho-Oh and Entei. Tail Glow can only be learned by Volpe and Manaphy, though only in BDSP. And Rocklicker can only be learned by Rhyperior and the Dwebble line. The Rhyperior only gets in everything but Legends Arceus. Now let's move on to signature moves. Starting with all the non-legendary signature moves, of which there are 109, which I'll show on the screen, raising our total to 681. As for the legendary signature moves, there are 61 that are available to us. Glaring Articuno gets Freezing Glare. Galarian Zapdos gets Thunderous Kick. Galarian Moltres gets Fiery Wrath. Lugia gets Aeroblast. Latias gets Mist Ball. Latios gets Luster Purge. Kyogre gets Origin Bolts. Groudon gets Precipitous Blades. Rayquaza gets Dragon Ascent. Jirachi gets Doom Desire. The Lake Trio gets Mystical Power. And Heatran gets Magma Storm. Dialga gets Roar of Time. Palkia gets Spatial Rend. Giratina gets Shadow Force. Regigigas gets Crush Grip. Cresselia gets both Lunar Dance and Lunar Blessing. Darkrai gets Dark Void. Manaphy and Fiona both get Take Heart, though Manaphy also gets Heart Swap. Shaman gets Seed Flare, and Arceus gets Judgment. Tornadus gets Bleak Wind Storm. Thunderous gets Wild Bolt Storm. Landorus gets Sandsear Storm. And Enamorus gets Springtide Storm. Now, due to the fusions, I believe that the best way to explain the Tail Trio is with a Venn diagram. Keldeo gets Secret Sword. Xerneas gets Geomancy. Yveltal gets Oblivion Wing. And Zygarde gets 4 signature moves: Land's Wrath, Core Enforcer, 1000 Arrows, and 1000 Waves. Silvally gets Multi Attack. Papus get Nature's Madness. Solgaleo and Duskmane Necrozma get Sunsil Strike. Lunala and Dawnwings Necrozma get Moongeist Beam. And Necrozma itself gets Prismatic Laser and Photon Geyser. And Cephalon gets Mind Blown. Zacian gets Behemoth's Blade. Zamazenta gets Behemoth's Bash. Eternatus gets Dynamax Cannon and Eterna Beam. Single Strike Urshifu gets Wicked Blow. Rapid Strike Urshifu gets Searching Strikes. Regieleki gets Thunder Cage. Regidrago gets Dragon Energy. Ice Rider Calyrex gets Glacial Lance. And Shadow Rider Calyrex gets Astral Barrage. The Treasures of Ruin get Ruination. Miraidon gets Collision Course. And finally, Miraidon gets Electro Drift. This brings our final total to 742 out of 808, leaving 66 moves left unavailable due to either not being in the code for the Switch games or being the signature move of a Pokemon that isn't obtainable within our rules. These moves are Assist, Beak Blast, Bestow, Camouflage, Captivate, Chip Away, Embargo, Feint Attack, Flame Burst, Foresight, Frustration, Grass Whistle, Happy Hour, Heal Block, Heal Order, Heart Stamp, Hold Back, Hold Hands, Hyperspace Fury, Hyperspace Hold, Iron Deluge, Jungle Healing, Lucky Charm, Magnet Bomb, Magnitude, Mad Block, Me First, Miracle Eye, Mirror Shot, Mud Sport, Natural Gift, Needle Arm, Nightmare, Odor Sleuth, Powder, Sucker Boost, Punishment, Pursuit, Refresh, Relic Song, Return, Rototilla, Secret Power, Signal Beam, Skydrop, Sky Uppercut, Smelling Salts, Snatch, Spiderweb, Spotlight, Steam Eruption, Steam Roller, Synchro Noise, Techno Blast, Telekinesis, Trump Card, Wake Up Slap, Water Sport, Ring Out, Punch of Fists, Searing Shot, Recreate, Double Lion Bash, Spectral Thief, Flower Cannon, and Diamond Storm. Finally, we'll be covering the abilities. Similar to the moves, I've divided the abilities into tiers. Signature abilities, rare abilities which only 2 Pokemon can have, uncommon abilities which only 3 to 5 Pokemon have, and common abilities which 6 or more Pokemon can have. Now the way I did this was actually by only counting the Pokemon that get it as a regular ability, excluding those who get it as a hidden ability. Any abilities which are hidden only, I'll cover afterwards. Now, once again, I used the list off of Bulbapedia, which lists 298 abilities. Now they count as one twice due to the different Calyrex forms, though I merged them together for this, giving us 297. However, when I wrote my list, it came to 296, and I spent ages trying to figure out what the missing ability was. So we'll roll with 296 for now, and if one of you can figure out what the missing ability is, please let me know in the comments. Now let's get started. The common abilities consist of 49 abilities, which are Battle Armor, Blaze, Chlorophyll, Clear Body, Compound Eyes, Cute Charm, Early Bird, Flame Body, Flash Fire, Frisk, Guts, Hustle, Hydration, Hypercutter, Ice Body, Inner Focus, Insomnia, Intimidate, Keen Eye, Levitate, Limber, Mold Breaker, Natural Power, Oblivious, Overgrow, Own Tempo, Pickup, Poison Point, Pressure, Rockhead, Runaway, Sand Veil, Shed Skin, Sheer Force, Shell Armor, Shield Dust, Snowcloak, Static, Strong Jaw, Sturdy, Swarm, Swift Swim, Technician, Thick Fat, Torrent, Unburden, Vital Spirit, Volt Absorb, and Water Absorb. These shouldn't be a problem to get. As for uncommon abilities, we have Adaptability, Anticipation, Big Pecs, Cheek Pouch, Competitive, Curse Body, Damp, Dry Skin, Effect Spore, Forewarned, Gluttony, Healer, Illuminate, Infiltrator, Iron Fist, Justified, Klutz, Leaf Guard, Lightning Rod, Magic Guard, Plus, Minus, Overcoat, Poison Touch, Prankster, Quick Feet, Rattled, Reckless, Regenerator, Rivalry, Sand Rush, Sand Stream, Sap Zipper, Scrappy, Serene Grace, Sniper, Solid Rock, Soundproof, Steadfast, Stench, Sticky Hold, Suction Cups, Super Luck, Tangled Feet, Tinted Lenses, Tough Paws, Unaware, Unnerve, Water Valve, and Weak Armor. This brings our total to 99 out of 296. Now for the rare abilities. I'll cover which Pokemon get what abilities. Aftermath is on the Drifloon line and Stunky line. Angle Point is on the Mankian line and all forms of Tauros. Arena Trap is on the Diglett line and Trapinch. Berserk is on Galarian Moltres and Drampar. Bulletproof is on the Jangmo line and Ursaluna. Defiant is on Galarian Zapdos and the Pawniard line. Drizzile is on Pelipper and Kyogre. Flower Veil is on the Flabébé line and Comfey. Fluffy is on the Stuffle line and the Wooloo line. Heatproof is on the Bronzor line and Roly-Poly. Honeygather is on Combee and the Cutiefly line. Immunity is on Snorlax and Zangoose. Iron Barbs is on the Ferroseed line and Togedemaru. Liquid Ooze is on the Tentacool line and Gulpin line. Magma Armor is on the Slugma line and Camerupt. Moxie is on the Sandile line and Scraggy line. Magnet Ball is on the Magnemite line and Nosepass line. Noguard is on the Machop line and Honedge and Doublade. Roughskin is on the Carvana line and Druddigon. Sandforce is on the Juba line and Incarnate form Landorus. Simple is on the Numel and the Bidoof line. Slush Rush is on the Cubchoo line and the Titan. Snow Warning is on the Snover line and Vanilluxe. Solar Power is on the Sunkern line and Tropius. Drought is on Torkoal and Groudon. Speed Boost is on the Yanma line and Ninjask. Storm Drain is on the Shellos line and Finneon line. Sweet Veil is on the Swirlix line and Nursery line. Telepathy is on the LGM line and Oranguru. Trace is on Porygon and Porygon 2 and the Ralts line minus Gallade. And White Smoke is on Torkoal and the Sizzlipede line. This brings our total to 130 out of 296, not even halfway, which came as a surprise to me. But this is where I'll be covering signature abilities. Now remember, I'm only counting obtainable Pokemon that get it as a regular ability and not as a hidden. For example, Poison Heal can be obtained from both Breloom and Gliscor. But Gliscor gets it as a hidden ability and thus won't count, leaving it as a signature ability for Breloom. With all that out of the way, let's get started, as there is a lot to go through. Rayquaza gets Airlock. Klawf gets Anger Shell. Farigiraf gets both Armor Tail and Cudchoo. Lechonk and female Oinkologne get Aroma Veil. Both forms of Calyrex get as one. Darkrai gets Bad Dreams. Yamper gets Bullfetch. Charjabug gets Battery. Chi-Yu gets Beads of Ruin. The Ultra Beasts get Beast Boost. Glastrier gets Chilling Neigh. The Psyduck line gets Cloud9. Kecleon gets Colour Change. Kamala gets Comatose. Tatsugiri gets Commander. Contrary is on the Inkay line. The Zalander line gets Corrosion. The Gossifleur line gets Cotton Down. Galarian Slowking gets Curious Medicine. Oricorio gets Dancer. Yveltal gets Dark Aura. Zamazenta gets Dauntless Shield. Roxas gets Dazzling. The Archon line gets Defeatist. Mimikyu gets Disguise. The Porygon line gets Download. Regidrago gets Dragon's Maw. Orthworm gets Earth Eater. Tapu Koko gets Electric Surge. Bellibolt gets Electromorphosis. Gliscopod gets Emergency Exit. Xerneas gets Fairy Aura. Mime Jr. and Mr. Mime get Filter. Cherim gets Flower Gift. Castform gets Forecast. Mousehold gets Friend Guard. Solgaleo gets Full Metal Body. Alolan Persian gets Fur Coat. Golden Go gets Good as Gold. The Wiglet line gets Gooey. Galarian Darmanitan gets Guerrilla Tactics. Tapu Bulu gets Grassy Surge. Spectria gets Grim Neigh. Robostiff gets Guard Dog. Cramorant gets Gulp Missile. Miraidon gets Hadron Engine. Duraludon gets Heavy Metal and Light Metal. The Azurill line gets Huge Power. Morpeko gets Hunger Switch. Ice-Q gets Ice Face. Zoroark gets Illusion. Kyukumuku gets In Is Out. Zacian gets Intrepid Sword. Male Oinkologne gets Lingering Aroma. Milotic gets Marvel Scale. The Clauncher line gets Mega Launcher. The Marini line gets Merciless. Galarian Sunfisk gets Mimicry. Tapu Fini gets Misty Surge. And Electivire gets Motor Drive. Arceus gets Multi-Type. The Yamask line gets Mummy. The Toadstool line gets Mycelium Might. The Coughing line gets Neutralizing Gas. The Skitty line gets Normalize. Espathra gets Opportunist. Koraidon gets Oracle Compulse. The Galarian Ponyta line gets Pastel Veil. Strudel gets Pickpocket. The Shroomish line gets Poison Heal. Longerna gets Power Spot. The Krozma gets Prism Armor. The Past Paradoxes get Photosynthesis. Tapu Lele gets Psychic Surge. And Toxicity gets Punk Rock. The Meditite line gets Pure Power. The Nacli line gets Purifying Salt. The Future Paradoxes get Quark Drive. Zarina gets Queenly Majesty. Galarian Slowbro gets Quick Draw. The Lotad line gets Rain Dish. Simeon gets Receiver. The Amora line gets Refrigerate. The Applin line gets Ripen. Silvally gets RKS System. The Silicobra line gets Sandspit. Wishiwashi gets Schooling. The Galarian Mr. Mime line gets Screen Cleaner. Arboliva gets Seed Sower. And Lunala gets Shadow Shield. The Wynot line gets Shadow Tag. Glade gets Sharpness. The Shelter line gets Skill Link. Regigigas gets Slow Start. The Youngoo's line gets Stakeout. Sableye gets Stall. The Mudbray line gets Stamina. Aegislash gets Stance Change. The Roly-Poly line gets Steam Engine. Delmwise gets Steelworker. Kingambit gets Supreme Overlord. Alolan Raichu gets Surge Surfer. Chien Pao gets Sword of Ruin. Boichin gets Tablets of Ruin. And the Alolan Diglett line gets Tangling Hair. Zekrom gets Terravolt. The Frickabax line gets Thermal Exchange. The Glimmet line gets Toxic Debris. Regieleki gets Transistor. Comfey gets Triage. Slakoth and Slakeng get Truant. Reshiram gets Turbo Blaze. Urshifu gets Unseen Fist. Tenglu gets Vessel of Ruin. The Galarian Yamask line gets Wandering Spirit. The Jupiter line gets Water Bubble. The Sandyglass line gets Water Compaction. Dashbund gets Well Baked Body. Wimpod gets Wimp Out. And the Watchful line gets Wind Power. The Ramblin line gets Wind Rider. Shedinja gets Wonder Guard. Sigilyph gets Wonder Skin. And Palafin gets 0 to Hero. This brings the total all the way up to 256 out of 296, which is a big improvement. Now there are two abilities that are left out here, Aura Break and Power Construct, the signature abilities of Zygarde. When I brought up the idea for this video to some friends, one of them brought up Zygarde. See, for most of these abilities, if a Pokemon that can have it doesn't have it, you can just use an ability capsule to change abilities. Similarly, you can use an ability patch for hidden abilities. However, ability capsules don't work on Zygarde, and since the one you catch in the Dynamax Adventures has Power Construct, then how do we get Aura Break? Well, another friend pointed out that once you capture Zygarde in the Dynamax Adventures, you can obtain the Zygarde Cube from an NPC installed inside, which allows you to swap abilities. With this, our total is now 258. The next few abilities can only be obtained through hidden abilities, so start saving up those ability patches. Analytic is on the Magnemite line, Staryu line, Porygon line, and LGM line. Co-Star is on Flamingo. Flare Boost is on the Drifloon line. Gale Wings is on the Fletchling line. Grass Pelt is on the Skidoo line. Harvest is on the Execute line, Tropius, Phantom and Smoliv line. Ice Scales is on the Snom line. Imposter is on Ditto. Libero is on Cinderace. Liquid Voice is on the Poplio line. Long Reach is on the Rowlet line. Magic Bounce is on the Natu line, Espeon and Hatena line. And Magician is on Klefki. Mirror Armor is on Corviknight. Moody is on the Remoraid line, Smeagol, Snorunt and Glalie, Bidoof line and Scovillain. Multiscale is on Dragonite and Lugia. Perish Body is on Cursula and Pixelate is on Sylveon. Propeller Tail is on the Arrokuda line. Protean is on Kecleon and the Sprigatito line. Rocky Payload is on Bombardier. Stalwart is on Duraludon. Steely Spirit is on Berserker. Symbiosis is on the Flabébé line and Oranguru. Toxic Boost is on Zangoose, and Zen Mode is on Darmanitan. Our total is now 284 out of 296. Nearly there. Now the next few abilities I'll cover are interesting. So there are a few abilities that are exclusive to temporary forms like Mega Evolutions. So you might be wondering, how do you register an ability like that when you can't transfer Mega Evolved Pokemon? Well, the Pokemon Company must have thought of this too, because Pokemon Home seems to automatically register those abilities when you transfer the Pokemon the form belongs to. For example, I first noticed this when the same friend pointed out the solution to the Zygarde problem brought up Neuroforce, which is Ultra Cosmos ability. Now obviously you can't transfer Ultra Cosmos to Pokemon Home, but when I checked, I had Neuroforce registered. So here are all the abilities that have the same issue. Error Late from Mega Pinsir and Mega Salamence. Delta Stream from Mega Rayquaza. Desolate Land from Primal Groudon. Neuroforce from Ultra Necrozma. Parental Bond from Mega Kangaskhan. And Primordial Sea from Primal Kyogre. This brings our final total to 290 out of 296. This amazingly only leaves 6 abilities that are left unavailable. Battle Bond from Ash Greninja. Galvanize from the Alolan Geodude line. Power of Alchemy from the Alolan Grimer line. Shields Down from Minior. Soul Heart from Magearna. And Victory Star from Victini. With all said and done, let's recap. Out of 1008 Pokemon, it's possible to attain 959 of them, which came out to a little over 95%. As for moves, we were able to get 742 out of 808, which came to a little under 92%. As for abilities, that came surprising 290 out of 296, which is just shy of 98%. Overall, I'm proud of how far we came today. Now obviously, these totals could go higher if you were lucky enough to get Event Pokemon or you transferred Pokemon through Bank or Go, but not everyone could do that, which is why I excluded them. Now as I mentioned earlier, it's very likely that there are some mistakes in this video. Feel free to point them out and I might even make a follow-up video if enough mistakes are spotted, or Scarlet Violet DLC comes out and changes things. Either way, that's going to do it for today's episode. Let me know if you enjoyed this video and feel free to leave any suggestions for similar video ideas you want to see me cover. Don't forget to like and subscribe and I will see you next time. See ya!